Now, before I do that, let me go back and talk about one last thing with regard to the cost of capital, which is the weighted average cost of capital. The weighted average cost of capital is something that you run across, and it's particularly relevant for big pharma companies because as a large company with lots of diverse projects, you typically need to have a single hurdle rate that you're asked to use for various different company projects. And that hurdle rate is often used as the weighted average cost of capital. And the way that you calculate that, not surprisingly, is very much along the lines of the CAPM and portfolio theory. So here's the basic argument. The value of a company is equal to the market value of the equity and the debt, right? So your market rate of return of the value of the assets of the company, the market return of the value of the assets is equal to the market rate of return of equity and the market rate of return of debt, but weighted by the fraction of your company financed by equity versus debt. So this is almost an accounting identity from here, right? I'm just calculating the rate of return based upon the rates of return of the two liabilities that you have. The rate of return of debt and the rate of return of equity are random variables. So if I take the average, the expectation, the average return on the assets is going to be equal to a weighted average of the expected return on the equity and the expected return of the debt. And now, if I come up with a beta for the equity and the debt, I can actually calculate the beta of the assets. And that beta will actually allow me to compute a cost of capital for the assets. So the weighted average cost of capital is nothing more or less than the weighted average of the required rate of return on the equity and the required rate of return on the debt. Very often, we will assume that debt does not have a market component. It's got a beta of 0. That's not quite right because in certain cases, whether debt defaults or doesn't default depends on whether the market is up or down. That's particularly true with highly leveraged companies where you've got junk bonds financing your operations. If you're close to default, then the beta is going to be pretty significant. Your junk bonds will look a lot like equity, and it'll have an equity beta to it. But this is the approach that most pharma companies and larger biotech companies will use in engaging in capital budgeting. They might use IRR in some cases, but they'll still need to compare that to hurdle rate. They'll use the WACC as the kind of a hurdle rate to decide whether or not a project should go forward or not go forward. And so this idea of pharma companies having lower betas, it means that pharma companies are going to have a lower hurdle to be able to take on projects, and that biotech companies are going to be challenged because of the nature of the cost of capital that they face. Just looking at how much you have to earn in order to stay in the good graces of investors is obviously going to be very, very difficult, particularly in this kind of a market climate, especially if you're worried about financing. So what we're going to do next time is to put all this together and ask the question, if we use portfolio theory, the way that financial economists think about investing in stocks and bonds, if we put together a portfolio of compounds, might we do better for investors as well as patients? And I think you'll be surprised at the answer because there'll be some cases where it works amazingly well, and there are cases where it completely breaks down, and we're going to go through all of those different scenarios. So I'll see you next time.